Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Battle for Australia annual oration. Not our commemoration, that's September. This is our 8th annual oration, and we're delighted to see so many members here today of the Battle for Australia Association New South Wales and friends of the association. As we begin our proceedings today, I'd like to share with you an acknowledgement of country which has been prepared for us by Harry Alley, well known to many of you, who's a member of our committee and is unable to be with us today, but has asked me to share with you his acknowledgement. So Harry says that we gather today on land that is sacred to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians whose ancestors have nurtured this land through deep time. We gather more than 80 years since those momentous days of 1942, which initiated critical air, land and sea battles around Australia and our region in the defence of our nation. Many Indigenous people have proudly served in Australian uniform, welcomed with dignity into service with our Defence Forces. Together, we can all take pride in the courage of those who have served over time and in the culture of our forebears. Today we acknowledge that heritage with gratitude for its gifts to us all, placing hope in its legacy and remembering the sacrifices that have made it possible. Well, today, a very special occasion, I said the 8th annual oration, and we're delighted to welcome Commodore Tim Brown AM to deliver the 2024 Battle for Australia oration. Commodore Brown led a specialist team of deep-sea experts, endured the effects of a tropical cyclone, sorry I'm reading from the publicity material here, conducted hours of painstaking research but also had some extraordinarily good luck before finally solving one of Australia's greatest naval mysteries, finding the final resting place of the sunken Montevideo Maru. And so Tim, we're very eager to hear you now deliver your oration for 2024, Finding the Montevideo Maru. Thank you very much. Could you welcome Tim, please?
Watch my step there. Good morning, everyone. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you allow me to preface my remarks with a vote of thanks to the Vice President Darren Mitchell, you the members and the supporters of the Battle for Australia Association. And I really appreciate the invitation to speak this morning, acknowledging the great work of your organisation. As a career submariner who had the opportunity to work at the strategic level of our nation's future submarine capability for almost the last 20 years, I can assure you that the defence of Australia remains foremost in the strategic calculus of defence, ever since those days that those words were marked. And as a submariner, I will also say that nuclear-powered submarines are the central pillar of the nation's defence strategy. I'd also like to thank Jackie and John Mullen, founders and directors of the Silent World Foundation, along with my colleagues who helped plan, organise, fundraise, film, research and argue for the search to take place. And they're in the audience here today. For without their indefatigable efforts, those on board the Montevideo Maru would be still waiting to be found. Shortly after 10 p.m. on June 30, 1942, the US Navy submarine USS Sturgeon spotted a darkened ship coming out of the Babuan Channel, making speed towards Hainan Island. After midnight, the unmarked Japanese merchant ship finally slowed, allowing the Sturgeon to work into a firing position. At 2:26 a.m. on July 1, Sturgeon fired 4 torpedoes from 4,000 yards, striking the unmarked vessel after the funnel. 11 minutes later, The Montevideo Maru was seen by the submarine to sink stern first and slip quickly below the waves. Incarcerated on the Japanese vessel were 1,054 Australian prisoners of war, 845 service personnel and 209 civilians. None of the Australians on board survived the sinking. It was the largest ever loss of life of Australians at sea in peace or wartime. Fast forward 81 years. Soon after lunch on April 18, 2023, the team from Silent World Foundation was summoned to the operations room on the deep ocean survey vessel Fugro Equator. The Hugin Echo Surveyor 8 Autonomous Underwater Vehicle, or AUV, that we were using was deployed on a detailed grid pattern just 100 metres above the seabed in search for the Montevideo Maru. It had been in the water for almost a week by now. Deployed for periods of 40 plus hours, it was in the early stages of its third data gathering mission. Some hours beforehand, it had been recovered from its second mission, the vast amounts of acoustic data recovered and downloaded, the battery replaced, and the AUV redeployed. It was the data from this second mission which was to prove to be so exciting. Earlier in the week, we had mapped the sea floor of the search area using the Fugro Equator's hull-mounted sonar. This information was then used to program the AUV so it could safely operate clear of the bottom and any underwater undulations. On this occasion, the seabed offered a flat and uninspiring landscape, something that would prove to be a huge advantage to us. Once the acoustic files were recovered, the Fugro's ocean surveyors would enter the data into the ship's onboard processors. Hours later, rough images of the ocean floor and what lay upon it would be produced. It was a time-consuming activity. On this occasion, the AUV was conducting its third full search run and the ship surveyors were processing the data from the second run. We had defined a large search area. US Navy records from the USS Sturgeon had described the position where they believed the Montevideo Maru had sunk. While there were other reported positions, we used the Sturgeon's assessment to define the most probable position. And the last known position is a central factor for the success of any maritime shipwreck search. From this position, various calculations were made to determine an area of primary probability, which ended up being about a 9 nautical mile radius around the last known position, which is about 14 kilometres. But this search area then had to be broken up into bite-sized chunks. The chunks reflected the capabilities of the AUV itself. We had spent about a week conducting trials and calibrations of the AUV. This was the first time that this AUV had been operated off the ship at the excessive depths that we were operating at. Additional equipment had been fitted to the back of the ship's standard equipment fit, and work was needed to ensure it was all operating in concert. This done, we then lost additional days seeking shelter as a cyclone crossed the Philippines. During this time, much effort was devoted to optimising the search pattern to cover the maximum area of possibility in the shrinking time available. This was assisted by us having learned more about the nature of the sea floor. It led us to define 9 search boxes of about 9,000 yards each and centred on the most probable position. A search box of this size could be covered by flying the AUV at 100 metres. Initially, we wanted to fly the AUV lower at 60 metres to ensure greater fidelity of the side scan sonar so that we didn't miss the ship, but this would have made the search area much smaller, which would then have extended the time on station considerably and the cost of the mission. Furthermore, working up the most likely position, we decided to initially search in a westerly direction, which would then take us along the predicted ship's track, before following a snail-like anti-clockwise spiral to search the entire area. Little did we know how important this would be. We had just commenced the counterclockwise spiral where the processing data from the second box on Montevideo's track when we were summoned to the ops room. On our arrival, the computer screen was showing two ship-like structures sitting upright on the ocean floor. An ocean floor, as I said, that was flat and featureless for miles around. It looked like a ship had broken in two, and the length and width were about right. We all knew in an instant that it had to be the Montevideo Maru. Further processing work of that data set was already underway, but the images already obtained were sufficient to make a call to redirect the AUV back to complete a more detailed survey of the two wrecked sections at a better flight hop of 60 metres. And the rest is history. For the next week, the AUV did multiple runs over the objects of interest and the associated debris field. When fused together, the data painted up the ghostly images of the Montevideo Maru, which were published all over the world a few days later. And hopefully if you saw the news, you would have seen these in all the newspapers, etc. We conducted measurements of masts, cranes, etc., and it matched exactly the data of the Montevideo Maru. Discovering the Montevideo Maru, our sense of adventure and our sense of accomplishment were quickly overwhelmed by appreciation and regard. My emotion then reflects the reason I'm honoured to speak today. I dare say we all share a deep, intuitive appreciation of war and the sacrifice of those citizens who volunteer their service to advance the cause of peace and justice. Telling how Hephaestus forged the shield of Achilles, Homer sets the deep roots of Western classical tradition. Homer shows us that war is a forge of cultures and a product of cultures. War is a deeply moral idea, a diabolical, grievous, inexpressibly complex endeavour. J.S. Mill put the point in Fraser's magazine in February 1862. He said, and I quote, "War is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest thing. The ugliest thing is the civilization unprepared to fight for truth and justice." Quoting Mill further, "If justice and injustice keep up their fight for ascendancy in the affairs of people, we must be willing, when needed, to do battle for good over evil." And these are the ideas which move us so very much when we discovered the Montevideo Maru. They are the ideas for which men and boys on the Montevideo Maru sacrificed all. The men and boys who died on the Montevideo Maru fought for right and justice. By the way, the youngest people who didn't stay as prisoners were 14, and 15-year-old boys were on the ship. Today, we acknowledge their tragic loss in one of the cruel twists which are inevitable in wartime. Among those lost were men from the army contingent known as Lark Force. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Scanlon, Lark Force was sent to defend Rabaul. Their position was reinforced with other units in nearby Cavayang. Rabaul was a township in East New Britain province, about 600 kilometres east of the island of New Guinea. Cavayang is the capital of the province of New Ireland, a large town on the island of the same name. In December 1941, 4 Hudson bombers and 10 obsolete Wirraway fighters from 24 Squadron RAF were also dispatched to Rabaul. A decision described by the historian Alan Stevens as an act of delinquency. Lark Force was no match for a massive Japanese invasion fleet, including 5,000 Marines, which swept down on New Britain on January 23, 1942. Rabaul and the surrounding settlements were quickly overrun by Japanese forces, which acted with great brutality towards Australian servicemen and civilians alike. In the weeks running up to the invasion, Canberra dithered about evacuating the civilian administration and finally did nothing. In secret diplomatic cables, the government acknowledged that in the event of conflict, the tiny army garrison at Rabaul was highly vulnerable and likely to be hostage to fortune. In February, an estimated 160 escaping Australians were massacred at the Toll plantation on the coast due south of Rabaul. In the end, around 400 members of Lark Force and a handful of civilians managed to get away, hiking vast distances across mountainous jungle terrain, before making a hazardous sea passage to the New Guinea mainland. Those who were not killed in the initial weeks of the Japanese invasion of New Guinea eventually surrendered and became prisoners of war. Paul Hazlitt, the author of 2 volumes of Australia's official Second War history, said, and I paraphrase, "To those who died and to those fugitives who struggled desperately to rejoin their countrymen belongs a tribute due to those who suffered and those who dared." Excuse me. Early in the morning of June 22, 1942, the Australian prisoners were marched to the wharf and embarked on the Montevideo Maru. The Australian public were not to learn of the ensuing tragedy until late 1945, when an Australian Army investigating officer in occupied Japan was given the Japanese government casualty list of the Australians who had been taken on board the ship. The men and boys lost with the Montevideo Maru came from all over Australia and from all walks of life. They included Harold Page, a decorated World War I veteran and Deputy Administrator of Australia New Guinea. Harold was the brother of the former Prime Minister Earl Page. Kenneth McKenny Ramsey from Corindi, New South Wales, was a commander with the 1st Independent Company and a star Wallaby forward. His last test had been against the All Blacks in Sydney in 1938. Arthur Gildage was a well-known Salvation Army bandmaster and music composer from Broken Hill. 7 Methodist missionaries based at Rebel were lost, including Sidney Beasley, uncle to Kim, the former leader of the Australian Labor Party, Ambassador to the United States, Governor of Western Australia, now the Chairman of the Australian War Memorial. Over the course of 80 years since her sinking, the tragedy of the Montevideo Maru has continued to stalk the lives of those relatives that were lost. Resonant across lifetimes, the significance of the tragedy of war were captured by Aeschylus in the play Agamemnon in 458 BC. Aeschylus has the chorus say, "Even in sleep, pain which cannot forget, falls drop by drop, until in our despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." Aeschylus unfolds war's indescribable human significance. He sees the timber and tragedy of conflict span the whole of society. In war, public life is united with domestic households in a shared calamity. Even conquest comes at the cost of unutterable distress. War must be the last resort, something we seek to avoid at almost all cost. But to recall J.S. Mill, some things are worth fighting for. And this is the reason we take today, this is the lesson we take today from the loss of the Montevideo Maru. In early 1942, modern Australia faced the most serious test of her short history. Japanese forces had descended with frightening speed into the South Pacific. At its peak, Japanese sea power had enabled them to forward deploy upward of 120,000 troops in Rabaul. Australia had insignificant naval force to deter. At sea, in the air and on the land, our forces, however courageous, were no match for a formidable force. The brutal lessons of history must not be forgotten, brushed aside as old news, past calamity, to be something impossible now in the modern age. Arguably, the battle for Australia started with the Japanese invasion of Australia-administered Rabaul. Even today, in times of relative peace, it is an unavoidable truth that the nation must be ready to defend herself. Australia's official strategic narrative continues to press the need for this nation, the world's largest island continent, our home, to pay more attention to national defence, where, along with the need for continued vigilance in defending our way of life, the deterrence at sea must prevail. We must heed the sacrifices of those souls who paid the price for our liberty, lest we forget. Thank you.
Jeffrey Usher, our resident poet.
We've met at the quay end of town to hear a great talk by Tim Brown on Montevideo Maru and the prisoners who drowned when the ship went down.
And another member of our committee, Christopher Dawson, to say a few words of thanks on our behalf to Tim.
Commodore, I'm not as seaworthy as you are, but I do think you gave us a wonderful talk. I've enjoyed learning about it a great deal. The other thing is that you're a bit hard on the poor old Brits. They did send the Prince of Wales and the, whatever it was, the Repulse. They went, and they were, we think they were rather foolish because they didn't have an aircraft carrier with them, but the aircraft carrier had been delayed. So, just speaking up to the Brits for a second, not for long. Just thank you so much, because you do show that submariners are a different breed.
I took my son to the War Memorial. We saw the Roll of Honour and all of those who fell. Found Private Douglas Cook, who died in Lone Pine long ago. We went inside and we looked at the world wars. And we cried for all of those on distant shores. Then I found my granddad's name and I cried for what became of him. Granddad ran a plantation in Papua New Guinea, up there in the tropics, on an island of plenty. Yes, life was good on an island up north. Then they took him away as a prisoner of war. First of July, 1942, the ship went down along with all its crew. Under friendly fire, the prisoners of war died too. Nobody knew where all the men had gone. They all went missing on the way to Hainan. And it wasn't till the end of the war that they found them again.